Welcome to the first of our psychology speaker series this fall. Good to see so many of you here. We have with us today Dr. Kevin Hoff. He's an assistant professor of organizational psychology at Michigan State University. He holds a PhD in industrial organizational psychology from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. So let's give him a nice warm welcome, please.
Yeah, so I'm really happy to be here, and I'm going to share with you a lot of data and a lot of my research on this question of the science of choosing a career, how to find success in the modern labor market. And so broadly, as Kate mentioned, my research is in the field of industrial organizational psychology, which I'll talk about. And one of the main questions that I'm interested in is what determines success? And when I say success, I don't just mean like economic success in terms of income, but also people's satisfaction with their career choices and their satisfaction with their jobs. So looking at success holistically, not just in terms of economic indicators, but also kind of psychological well-being. So just to help me a little bit kind of understand who's in the room, I'm just going to do a quick sort of informal poll. If you could just raise your hand, depending on which of these three options best applies to you. So are you, let's say raise your hand if you feel like you're pretty committed to a specific career or occupation. Okay, that's most people here. Have a general idea of like the career field, or really are not sure at all? Okay, awesome. So at least some people in each bucket, and I think it's totally fine. This talk is kind of for everyone in those buckets. I think when I was like ending high school and starting college, I would have been more in this third bucket, and I'll talk about my career and sort of how I ended up where I am, but a lot of it was not really linear and a lot of sort of happenstance along the way. So I'll also start by just kind of reading some quotes aloud, and you can make a decision for yourself whether or not you think this is useful advice. But this is kind of often things that you hear in the media and from celebrities talking about a career. So this quote is attributed to Confucius, but if you Google it online, there's about like at least 10 or 15 people who may or may not be responsible for this quote. Choose a job you love, and you will never have to work a day in your life. Or I think this was actually Steve Jobs who said this, that the only way to do great work is to love what you do. If you haven't found it yet, keep looking, don't settle. So I'll tell you my opinions about these quotes is that I think I understand sort of the sentiment behind them, that there's a job for everyone out there and that you should really try to find the right fit for you and you'll be happier. And I definitely agree with that. I'm not sure if these are necessarily useful, quotes, because I think they're definitely overstated. And I know, I generally speaking love my job, but I certainly feel like I have to work sometimes. And so there's some parts of my job that I don't love as much. And I don't really know anyone who feels like even if they really love their job, they never have to do any work. So some of it's just kind of setting the expectations in terms of, what is it to have a great job? Always there's going to be some amount of things that maybe you don't have to do. And another reason why I think those quotes are not super helpful is just kind of the realities of the labor market. So this is data from the baby boomer generation, so people who were born in around 1960, and this was followed from age 18 to 56, and all this graph is showing is the cumulative number of jobs that people had on average across from age 18 to 56. So this is not yet like the end of their career. Most of the people are still working. So on average, people held around 12.7 jobs during this time. And the way that the workforce is changing, it's likely that most people in this room will probably hold more by the time you're 56. So going back to those quotes, I think, like I said, the realities of the labor market are different. And you might find a job that you really love and feel like you can stay in forever, but due to whatever circumstances, you can't necessarily stay in it forever. So one of the themes of this talk is that really like adaptability and being able to market yourself is super important regardless of whatever career field you end in. So this is really what my talk is going to focus on, these three main topics. The first one is a lot of my research on how strongly fit, and particularly like finding a job that fits your interests, predicts success. I'll next talk about some of my research on going back to the realities of the labor market and how you can kind of navigate the balance between really finding a job that you love, like your dream job, versus the labor market realities. And then the third part of the talk, I'll sort of broaden it to focus on not just my research, but research in general in industrial organizational psychology on really a range of factors that predict job satisfaction and income. And I'll also talk about some of the current workforce trends related to AI and the changing workforce. Before I do any of that, I'll tell you a little bit about my own career background and how I ended up at Michigan State. So as a kid, my deepest interests were in sports and nature. So I grew up in the Chicago area and used to go sometimes on camping trips to Michigan. That's pictured rocks you see, and that's me playing hockey. I wanted to be a professional hockey player as a kid. That was my career goal. At some point along the way, I realized that was not going to happen, and so I gave up on that dream. And as an undergrad, I went to University of Illinois, and I was trying to kind of decide on a major when I was in high school. And my mom had majored in psychology, and she said, "You shouldn't major in psychology. You can't really get a job with a bachelor's degree in that field, so just might as well choose something else." And I understand the sentiment behind what she was saying, that oftentimes if you do want to work specifically in the field of psychology, doing clinical work or counseling, you do often need a master's degree. But it turned out that I did have a little bit of regret, because my senior year of college, I decided I wanted to pursue a PhD in psychology, and I hadn't really taken any psychology classes, nor did I have psychology research. And so I was kind of catching up and trying to figure out what does it take to get into a PhD program, and realizing that I was way behind. And so after I graduated, I worked, basically I just tried to find any research job that I could get that was related to psychology. And so I don't know if any of you have heard of human factors psychology, but that's kind of a related field to my current one, but it's kind of psychology applied to technology and designing systems around optimizing human interaction with computers, or the way airplane pilots, their cockpit is set up. And I also took some classes at a community college just to kind of get some actual psychology knowledge that helped me get into grad school. I started grad school, I thought I wanted to do clinical or counseling psychology, and so I started in a PhD program. I got into one program out of the 12 that I applied to, and it was also at Illinois, so I was still in Champaign. And in my second year of the PhD program, you start doing practicum, which is working to do actual counseling work as part of your schooling. And I realized pretty quickly that I didn't want to be a counseling psychologist for my whole career, and I was kind of just randomly, I think, lucky in retrospect that my advisor was he was both in counseling psychology and industrial organizational psychology, or IO. And I had honestly never heard of IO psychology before starting grad school, or I'd maybe heard of it, but I didn't think good things about it necessarily. But the main thing that appealed to me is that I didn't have to do practicum anymore, so I could keep doing research and still get a PhD in psychology, but not have to do the practicum work that I was pretty sure I didn't want to do when I finished grad school anyway. So I ended up in IO psychology. My first job after grad school was at University of Houston, and then I moved to Michigan State. This is my third year at Michigan State. So the main theme is that there was not a clear path throughout all these stops along the way, and I think a lot of it was sort of random and just sort of getting experience and seeing what I liked and didn't like. There were some jobs I had also along the way that I didn't show up there, that some of which I liked. Some of them were not great, but I am pretty happy with where I am now. So I feel lucky to have ended up in IO psychology, but like I said, I think really for a lot of people, it's not a clear linear path, and it's okay if you don't know, what you want to do now, or maybe even in 20 years, you end up changing your career, and that's totally okay and normal. So you might be wondering, what is exactly industrial organizational psychology? I don't know, has anyone seen the movie Office Space? If you remember the Bobs, who are the consultants who were brought in to kind of downsize the organization. That was what I always associated IO psychology with before I really knew what the field was these kind of consultants who come in and try to like fire people just to like make the company more efficient. And I think that's really not at all true. Maybe there's some of that that's still a little bit in IO psychology, but really it's mostly about helping people and making work better for employees. And so the textbook definition is it's just the application of psychological principles and theories to the workplace, or what I often just tell people is it's just psychology applied to work. And so there's a lot of topics that IO psychologists study. Some of it's around worker well-being, some of it's around like hiring methods and how do you best predict who's going to perform well and stay in a job. Some of it's around like leadership development. My research within this field is, as I mentioned, sort of focused on understanding what factors promote career success in terms of especially like people's income and their satisfaction with their job and their career choices. And in particular, I also study the use of career fit tests, so tests that you might take to explore what careers match your interests or your skills and knowledge. So that will be the first sort of third of the talk here, is how strongly does fit, and in particular like interest fit, predict career success? And so there are a lot of different ways to study fit in the workplace. Sort of like what I will mostly focus on is interest fit. And most often, like when you think about work environments, you can think about like a job or occupation. That's like your kind of career choice. There's also like obviously what organization you work for. There's, you could have fit that you might really like your organization, but not like your coworkers, or vice versa. You might really love your coworkers, but not like your supervisors. And so there's lots of different ways in which you might fit, different sorts of environments within your current job. And there's also different ways in which you might fit. So you might have really be interested in what you're doing, but it doesn't match your values, like in the sense that you have to commute extra far or whatever. So I will, by the end of this talk about kind of all of this and these different types of fit, but just for now we'll focus on interest fit, which again is really focused on like kind of choosing a career or broad occupation. So vocational interests is the technical term for it. I often just call them like career interests, but they're defined as enduring preferences for work activities and environments. So everyone here has probably a set of interests that describe things that you like to do. It turns out that people's preferences for work tend to be related to their leisure interests, and also like if you like a certain set of things, you're more likely to like similar sets of things. And interest it's a key driver of motivation. So when you're really interested in something, it's easier to sustain your attention, to focus for longer, and to persist through obstacles. So interest inventories, like I'm guessing some people in here have taken probably this particular measure, the O-Net Interest Profiler, which is the US Department of Labor's like primary career exploration tool. And basically the way it works is you answer 60 questions about things you like to do, and then you get an interest profile. And then it compares, so these are the 6 interest categories. It compares your interest in these 6 categories to the corresponding interests of all the different occupations in the US. And then you get sort of a list of occupations that fit you best. So I'll talk about each of these interest categories throughout the talk. I guess I'll just briefly define them here. But so realistic interests have to do with working with like real things or tools and machines. It's not like if you're necessarily a realistic person. It's specifically like working with real materials. Investigative is research and science interests. Artistic is pretty self-explanatory, like the arts and self-expression. Social interests are specifically involving helping people, so teachers, counselors. Enterprising interest also involves a lot of people and social interactions, but more so in like a business context where influence and leadership is key. And then conventional interests are working with like data and numbers and following set routines, things like that. So the way that these career fit tests work, as I mentioned, is so you have a set of scores on those 6 interest dimensions. And the idea is that if people show better interest fit with the occupation that they choose, better employment outcomes will result from that. And so this is my set of scores on those 6 RIASEC categories, as we call them, where you can see that for me, so the higher scores means I'm more interested in them. So I was investigative, so that's my strongest interest. My next strongest was artistic, and then social. And then kind of medium or lower interested in realistic and enterprising, and my lowest interest is in conventional. So then every occupation that the US has, which are really kind of broad categories of work, also has a set of scores on these 6 interest categories. And so this is the interest profile for a psychology teacher, which is my occupation. And so you can see that it's a pretty good fit. The social interests of psychology teachers is maybe a little higher than mine, but overall, like kind of the things that where I'm high in terms of my interest, the occupation also is high, and it tends to be low in areas where I'm not that interested. This would be an example of an occupation that does not fit me well, so an auto insurance appraiser, where you can see it's kind of the opposite interest profile, so there's not a lot of artistic, investigative, or social interests involved in auto insurance appraising. There's a lot of realistic and conventional interests, so this would be a strong negative relationship between my interests and this job. But that's really the mechanics of how all these career fit tests are working. Oftentimes they're correlating a set of attributes about a person with those of an occupation, and then showing like the best fitting occupations based on what you provide them with. So I've done some research on how interest fit predicts job satisfaction, different facets of satisfaction. This is the results from a meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis is like a type of research method where you average together the results from a bunch of individual studies. And so you get like an estimate of the overall relationship between, in this case, interest fit and satisfaction across, we had so 192 different samples and like almost 40,000 participants. And then what you're seeing here is like this is the effect size estimate, which is just a correlation coefficient, so the little R symbol. So you can see on average, the correlation between interest fit and job satisfaction is about 0.2 or 0.19. Tends to be a little bit stronger for people's satisfaction with their job choice or their choice of an organization. So it's a positive relationship, meaning that, yeah, people who are more interested in their job or show better fit tend to be more satisfied, but it's not a super strong relationship. Interest fit is actually more strongly related to job performance. So this is the results of a separate meta-analysis led by, actually, this is my colleague at Michigan State, that looks at interest fit and how it relates to different types of performance outcomes. So these are most often rated by supervisors. So overall performance, the correlation between interest fit and overall performance is 0.32. Organizational citizenship behaviors is the strongest here, and that's kind of like whether or not you do work outside of your specific job duties that benefit the organization, like helping coworkers or staying late when necessary. But again, they're all positive relationships, and again, they're a little bit stronger than for satisfaction. I've also done some research that shows that people who are working in jobs that better fit their interests tend to earn higher incomes. Again, it's moderate size relationships, so there's a lot of other factors that impact income, but it does tend to be positively related. So to summarize, interest fit, it's associated with positive employment outcomes in terms of job satisfaction, job performance, and higher income. As I said, they're not super strong correlations, and so they're all small to moderate in size, suggesting that there are certainly benefits of working in a job that fits your interest, but there's a lot of other things that matter too. I will definitely get to those other things as well. But before I get to that, I've also done some research on this question of are there really kind of enough interesting jobs to go around, and looking at this idea that, going back to those quotes at the beginning, everyone wants to have a job that they love and that they're really passionate about, but there's not, the labor market in some ways dictates what's available. And so unfortunately, like I realized at some point, I wasn't going to be an NHL player, and a lot of people want to be astronauts or cool things when they're young. At some point, the reality sets in, and the labor market just, if we could all be professional athletes, to me that would be great, but there would be no one to watch us and provide money. So the labor market often dictates what jobs are available. And so I say often because it is possible certainly to like create a job, and being an entrepreneur is like that. So you can, if you're ambitious enough and kind of have the support and resources needed, you can create jobs, but more often you're limited to what's available in your area in the labor market, or if you're able to work online, then that broadens the scope of what jobs are available. I think as someone who studies interest and has helped work on developing interest inventories, like my motivation for doing this research is that when you take an interest inventory and are given a set of results, like it doesn't really consider at all the number of jobs that are available that involve different interests. So I was curious just like kind of how people's career aspirations and their interests relate to the availability of jobs in those areas. So I'll share with you 2 studies that I led related to this question. In this first one, we used a sample of over 3,000 US teenagers from age 13 to 18 years old that were from 42 states in the US. And the main thing that we asked them was like, what is your career aspiration? And then we coded they were self-report responses, and we coded those into the categories used by the US Department of Labor, so we could see how they relate to basically the actual numbers of jobs for those careers, and then also projections about the future of work. And really the main finding was that, as you would probably expect, there are large gaps between the sorts of jobs that young students, and in particular teenagers, aspire to and the number of those jobs available. So about 50% of the teenagers in the sample, their career aspiration involved like primarily investigative or artistic interests, so like science and research or the arts. But those jobs, unfortunately, they only account for about 8% of the labor market. In particular, like artistic, it's very rare to be able to work in like a primarily artistic job. It's like less than 2% of the labor market. So there's a lot more people that are aspiring to those careers than there are jobs available. On the other hand, so less than 1% of the teenagers in the sample aspired to a job that involves conventional interests, which is again an interest that like involve, oftentimes it's data and numbers, but following like systematic procedures, often in an office setting. And those jobs are actually pretty common, so it's about like 20% of the labor market that primarily involve conventional interests. So there are really big gaps in terms of, like youth's career aspirations and the jobs that are available. And I think that's, to some extent, that's okay, and that's part of, learning about careers. And, we don't really want necessarily like 13-year-olds to have everything figured out or to be looking at employment numbers when they're thinking about what they want to do. But I do think there are some implications for career development among like kind of high school and middle school students, and one of which is that some of the most common like career aspirations were just things that people see most often on TV. So like a lot of young boys actually wanted to be professional athletes, and like teachers, and it's great to want to be teachers, but like what was missing was a lot of like lesser known careers that we know are going to be important in the future of work. And so these pictures here just show like this is applications of interests in elementary school, where you can see that RIASEC model and helping kids understand their interests and how they connect to careers from a young age. So some of the, for example, fast-growing conventional interest careers that almost no one said they wanted to be when they were a teenager, are like being a statistician, a web developer, or database administrators. And these are often well-paying careers, too, that are likely to kind of grow in the future. And then I think a lot of people also, like students in the sample, wanted to be like very ambitious careers. Like they wanted to be doctors, or some of them wanted to be astronauts. And I think that's really great, and we're not trying to discourage that in any way, or that shouldn't be the case. But you can kind of balance out ambition with some actual like real data about what does it take to become a doctor, and the pathways for that, and the actual numbers of doctors that there are. And so building a little bit more kind of this information around like what does it take to involve different jobs, and exposing kids to different jobs from a young age that they wouldn't otherwise be exposed to. One major limitation of this work was that, as I said, it was a bunch of teenagers, and I think we don't really expect teenagers to have all this information. And And so I was really interested in kind of doing a similar study, but with adults. So that will be the next study that I share with you here, where in this case we focused on interest, supply, and demand in the labor market. So looking at this question of how does the supply of adults' vocational interests, so meaning like the number of people who have different vocational interests, compared to the demand for jobs that involve different interest profiles. And so for this study, we got a really big sample of like over 1.2 million US residents who lived all across the US. And they had all taken an interest inventory. And so they were ranged in age from 18 to 63 years. It was pretty diverse in terms of ethnicity and gender. And again, we used this RIASEC interest model. So really, the first question was like, what sorts of jobs are people most interested in, like in aggregate? So if you look at a single person's, like what do they score strongest in? So you might think about these 6 areas for yourself, and think like, which of these areas am I most interested in? If you're like, really interested in psychology, it's probably like the social and investigative, and artistic is also correlated with that. So many psychologists at least have like social, artistic, and investigative as their strongest interests. As I sort of alluded to earlier when I was talking about them, there are some underlying dimensions. So realistic is primarily like working with things. People is more so social and a little bit enterprising. There's also a kind of an underlying dimension between working with data over here versus more so working with ideas over there. And then just to kind of show you, these are also very broad interest categories. And so one picture doesn't really do them justice, but just kind of giving other examples of careers that would fit into these. So again, maybe make a guess in your head of which you think is the most popular among people. So here are the results for that question in terms of this pie chart. So again, this is the 1.28 million people who took an interest inventory, and then this is the distribution of their strongest interests. So you can see that the most popular was artistic, so about 23% of the sample. That's their strongest interest, closely followed by social and enterprising. Investigative was 4th, realistic 5th, and then not a lot of people were primarily interested in conventional. So that's kind of the same finding that we had with the teenagers, but also here with like adults and using a full interest inventory, not just their career aspiration. There's also, often with career interest, there are some differences by gender. And so just to show you those results as an FYI, so this is the pie chart for women in the sample, and then that's the pie chart for men in the sample. You can see that the biggest difference is in terms of like realistic and social interests. So there's a lot more women that have strong social interests, and a lot fewer have like realistic interests as their strongest. And for men, yeah, so more realistic and kind of more evenly distributed. And I think this, I've also done some research on this and on this question of gender differences in interest, and I think a lot of it does relate to kind of the gender differences that exist in the workforce. And when people are thinking about what careers fit them, they often are, in some ways relying on information about who's already working in those careers. And so this is changing, I should say, but it does show that there are gender differences in at least some of these interest categories. So now getting back to this question, the overall question that we were interested in this paper is, how do people's interests compare to job demands in those same interest categories? And so now what I've done is just basically taken the slices of the pie chart and put them into bars. So the gray bars here are people's interests. So the gray bars add up to 100%, similar to the way the pie chart did. And then next to it are the job demands of the 2014 labor market. So we use 2014 because that's when the data was collected, but I'll also show you like the current labor market. But really there are really big gaps, and it tended to be sort of the same pattern of results as with the teenagers' career aspirations. So investigative and artistic, there's a lot more people who have those interests than there are jobs. The artistic gap is the most striking, where It was about, again, like 23% of people have it as their strongest interest, but it's about 2% of the labor market or even less than that. By contrast, so that we call those interest supply surpluses, like there's a lot more people than there are jobs in those involving those interests. On the other hand, so there's a lot more jobs that involve realistic and conventional interests than there are people who have those interests. So those are like supply shortages. And again, the conventional one is the biggest, and that's the same one that we found with the teenagers and their career aspirations. And then just to show you the results with like the current labor market. So obviously jobs are changing continually, and these results are kind of a snapshot in time. But if you look at it again in 10 years, and these again are very broad interest categories, and so there are changes happening within them, but across them, like it's relatively robust. If you look at the 2024 labor market, basically the same pattern of findings, although the number of jobs slightly differed from 2014 to 2024. So I think these results, they clearly show that like there are large gaps between what people are interested in and the number of jobs available. And so what that necessarily means is that there are going to be large numbers of people overall in the labor market who aren't able to work in the job that they're most interested in. And I think, especially involving artistic and conventional, I mean, you often you hear, I'm sure some people in here have, really strong artistic interests. Like you would love to be an artist or a musician or an actor. And, people, I think, have a generally intuitive sense that like those are hard jobs to get, and they can be hard jobs to be employed for your life with. And so it's not saying it's impossible, but there's just a lot more people who have artistic interests that are sort of unfulfilled by their work. Whereas on the other hand, there's a lot of people who are working in conventional jobs that primarily involve conventional interests that aren't especially interested in them. And that's, again, just sort of the necessity of the way the labor market is structured. So what can you do about it? I think one option is obviously to change jobs, and that's part of the use of an interest inventory is understand what you're interested in and if there are careers that would fit them better. I think it's not always possible for people, and so another strategy is what we call like job crafting, which is where employees are able to like kind of craft their job in ways that you might still be in the same occupation, work for the same company, but your job is a little bit different in ways that enable you to more so like fulfill your interests. So that can involve like, maybe doing some artistic work. Maybe it's not your main job duty, but you help design brochures or other like website information as some way to express your artistic interest without fully changing your job. And sometimes that's possible, sometimes it's not. I think one other main implication of this is that it's really okay and fairly normal to be working in a job that you aren't super interested in, or that you're not interested in at least like everything that you're doing in that job. Because there really are a lot of people, and your job, the ways in which your job and your life interact could be the case that your job is your way to fulfill your interests outside of work. And sometimes too, if you really make like your strongest interest in life to be your job, you might find that you become less interested in it because you're now all of a sudden, if you're really interested in arts and you have to sort of make an income from art, what you really love, like the creative expression part of it, has become also about like kind of making money and more stress added to that. So that's the main implication there. As we move on to, by the way, I should say if you want to ask questions throughout, please feel free. And so now might be a good time to pause if anyone does have any questions about the results I just showed. Yep, Kate.
I had a question about, like, where did you get those million people? Use the microphone. My question was simply,
Who are the participants in that adult study version? Like,
Yeah, that's a great question.
where would they go to take that test?
So the specific interest inventory that we used was the strong interest inventory, it's called. I guess I don't have it on the slide, but it's probably the most popular interest inventory that is sold to, like, a lot of it is college students, and community colleges, like the career centers. Like if you were to go to the career center here and say, like, I need help exploring a career, they might have the strong interest inventory. This was collected over like a 10-year period. So, and it wasn't necessarily representative of the US. We did weight the sample to match like the distribution of the gender and ethnicity and age distribution of the US. So it was more likely to generalize. But it is hard. I mean, it's hard to get big data sets, and so oftentimes, like what researchers will do is work with companies who already have them and have some agreement to use the data. Any other questions? Okay, so moving on to the third part of the software, we'll sort of broaden the focus. We've talked a lot about fit, and particularly like interest fit, but now looking at other factors that predict success. And again, when I say success, it's both economic and satisfaction-based or intrinsic success in today's labor market. So it's an overall sort of baseline, like how satisfied are people with their jobs in the United States. Here are the results of a Pew Research survey from 2023. And this is what you see here on the bars over there are the percentage of people who say that they're either extremely or very satisfied with their job overall. That's the yellow bar, and then the green bars are like specific facets of their job. So in terms of the number of people who are very satisfied or extremely satisfied, it's about 51% of people overall. If you just look at if you include satisfied in that, it's about like 80% of people would say they're at least like satisfied with their job. But the typical pattern, so the things that people tend to be least satisfied with tend to involve more of like the economic aspects of their jobs, so how much they're paid, their opportunities for growth, their opportunities for training and developing new skills. In terms of like the nature of work, so the day-to-day tasks is sort of medium. And then people tend to be most satisfied with their coworkers and supervisors, although I think supervisors is a gray area where there's a lot of people who that's probably like the worst part of their job. And for people, if you've ever had a bad boss before, it can really seep into the rest of your life and might be sort of the least favorite part of your life. But yeah, this is the overall picture. And so certainly it shows that there's a lot of room for growth, but about half of people are very satisfied or extremely satisfied. That's okay, I guess. So that's just the overall descriptive results. If you think about like what factors predict or explain variability in job satisfaction, I'll name a few. So on the top part, there are personal attributes that are associated with job satisfaction. These are often things that we think about in terms of like, people are different and they bring, different aspects of them to work. And so it's more so in terms of that first idea that I talked about, like finding a job that fits you in terms of your interests or values or your personality, your knowledge, skills, and abilities. And then there's a number of factors that relate to like your job or your work setting and your organization, and that are also really important. Some of those overlap with like things that you might fit with. Some of them just tend to be the case where like, people who work in jobs that have less stress and less interpersonal conflict, not surprisingly, tend to be more satisfied. Same thing with like job autonomy. Generally speaking, people with more autonomy tend to be more satisfied. I'll talk about each of these and show you like results from meta-analyses saying like how strongly they are correlated with job performance in a few slides. But first, so getting at this first question, like looking at those personal attributes, I've talked a lot about interest fit. I haven't really talked about those other types of fit. And so I led a study where we developed fit measures that tapped into kind of like a whole person perspective on fit. So not just interest, but also personality, work values, and then skills and knowledge. And then we looked at correlations between like showing fit with your job in terms of each of these domains and your satisfaction with your career choice. So this was from about 559 working adults in the United States. And here are the correlations. So you can see interest fit was most strongly associated with career choice satisfaction. They're all positive, though, so it also mattered whether or not you fit your job in terms of personality, in terms of your work values, in terms of your skill fit and knowledge fit. And then we looked at the same question using not just career choice satisfaction, but 2 other outcomes, so job satisfaction and income. And this is actually, these are results from community college graduates. So in my previous job at University of Houston, I collected data on, we started with like 500 community college graduates right before they were graduating and followed them for 14 months after. And so this is their, basically like their interests, values, knowledge, skills, and personality measured right when they were graduating compared to their job characteristics like 14 months later, and seeing what, so now the different colors of the bars show the size of the relationships between these different types of fit and the outcomes. So you can see that for career choice satisfaction, interest fit tended to be the strongest relationship, as I just mentioned. Kind of a similar pattern for job satisfaction, although like skill fit also mattered for job satisfaction. The results were definitely different for income, where for income, knowledge fit was the strongest predictor. So showing a good fit in terms of your knowledge versus the knowledge that the job requires was the most important. And that makes sense because knowledge does tend to be like the most proximal predictor of people's job performance. So if you have knowledge that fits your job, you're more likely to perform better, and that should lead to higher income. So all these types of fit, they do matter. Again, I think they're not always the thing that matters the most in terms of explaining, in particular, job satisfaction. So if we think about some of those other factors that I mentioned, and these are the results from a bunch of different meta-analyses that are all kind of compiled together, and these are all, what I'm showing here are correlations with job satisfaction. And most of these things have to do with either they're self-reported or they come from like an indicator of the environment. But you can see that the actually like the strongest predictors of job satisfaction are people's perceptions of fairness. So there's 2 different types of fairness perceptions, but procedural justice is like the idea that the procedures are fair, whereas distributive justice is that like resources, like the way incomes are set up, are distributed fairly. So those are both pretty closely related to each other. And they're both really strongly related to job satisfaction. And so, if you've ever worked in a job where you maybe found out that like your coworker is making more than you, even though you have the same job, that's a pretty quick way to be less satisfied with your job. Or just if you think things are unfair in general in terms of who gets promoted. So fairness perceptions are a huge factor. The next set of factors are relationships involve like the people you work with. So having more relationship conflict is negatively associated with job satisfaction. Leadership behaviors tend to be positively associated with job satisfaction. This is like sort of like leadership effectiveness behavior. So people who work for good bosses tend to be more satisfied with their jobs. The next set of factors are more so like job characteristics. So as I mentioned, like autonomy is something that people tend to be more satisfied the more autonomy they have. Skill variety is like, are you able to do different things in your job, or are you sort of just repeatedly using the same skill, like very monotonous? Feedback is really important. People like getting feedback on how they're doing. And if you ever worked in a job too where you're not really sure how you're doing because no one is telling you, that can be a source of stress and reason to be less satisfied with your job. Job insecurity is also here, and that's a strong negative predictor of job satisfaction. And then work-family conflict is also negatively associated with job satisfaction. So if your work or your job requirements sort of conflict with your family life, that would be a reason why people are less satisfied. This is just like, these results are just in general. People tend to be more satisfied as these variables go up or down. I think what's not shown here and what gets more complicated to analyze and compare are like people's values differ. And so we did look at value fit earlier as one of the types of fit that predicts satisfaction and income, and it does tend to be positively associated. But I think it's hard to measure values actually in a way that like you can compare them across people, because people differ obviously in terms of what they care about most in their job. And so What's not shown here, but I think is also really important for job satisfaction, is like the extent to which your job matches like your most important values. And so, for you right now versus like you in the future, that might differ. Like, what do you most care about for being satisfied in a job? It might be, for me, I've never been able to think of myself like having a long commute to work every day. So I really am, like, I live close to Michigan State's campus and I can walk to work, and that like is a huge factor that makes me satisfied with my job. Scheduling can be a big thing, especially that's something that intersects with like your family life, whether or not you, especially now after COVID, like a lot of people are working hybrid, or they might work remotely where they can work from home 2 days a week, having flexibility in their job. Some people, even these job characteristics, some people actually maybe don't care as much about autonomy, so for them this wouldn't matter as much. But really, so yeah, your values I think are super important in explaining what you're satisfied with. So the final thing I want to talk about today relates to the future of work and changes that are happening to the way so how work is done, where I'm sure all of you are kind of repeatedly exposed to stuff about AI changing the workforce, and some jobs are threatened and jobs are changing with technology. There's like who does the work, so companies are kind of increasingly using like crowdsourcing or gig workers, which could lead to lower job security for people. And then when and where work is done, so as I mentioned, like remote work is a lot more common now after COVID, or just kind of having hybrid work schedules and workspaces that are set up in different ways. So lots of changes are happening. This is a graphic showing around 47% of existing jobs in the US are at high risk of being automated in the next decade or so. And I have a spoiler that this was actually from 2013. So I think this was actually this paper by Frey and Osborne in 2013, like estimated the automation like risks across the entire labor market, and they had this big headline that like 47% of all jobs are going to go away because of automation in the next decade or so. That's what they said. And that turned out to be wrong, especially like the jobs that they predicted. Some of them were right, but some of them are wrong. And so you hear a lot about this, and I think it's not to say that like there's nothing here. Like clearly, and if you look historically, like in Michigan, especially like the the automotive industry, like those jobs have gone away because of automation has replaced human workers. And so this is always happening in the sense of job demand changing as a result of computers being able to replace human workers. But it's not always as like sort of dramatic as it's made out to be. And part of it is like no one really knows exactly what's going to happen. And so certainly there are best guesses about jobs that are easier to automate versus harder to automate. But I wouldn't believe every sort of dire prediction that you read. So if we look at some data, this is from 2023. So every year, actually, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is the U.S. Department of Labor's like primary source of or department that manages like the workforce and who's working in the workforce, they come out with projections about the next 10 years, like what occupations are going to be growing versus declining. So these are the top 10 occupational groups that are projected to grow the fastest. So these are broad categories of occupations, kind of like industries. So you can see that on average, like the total workforce is expected to grow by about 4% in the next 10 years. And so these are jobs that are all exceeding that 4%. And so healthcare support is the biggest. Part of that is due to like, we have an aging population of particularly like the baby boomer generation that are going to need healthcare and more people working in healthcare. Computer and mathematical, these are a lot of those like conventional interest jobs that involve working with data and numbers and understanding how to do statistics. So the third one is also involving healthcare, sort of different levels of healthcare. This is more like technicians and supporting roles in healthcare. This is more so healthcare practitioners and technical workers. Community and social service is also up there. Again, these are broad categories of work. So if we look at, in particular, like the fastest growing specific occupations, this is the percent employment change, which is what the results are based on. It's important to notice that like some of these jobs are much bigger than others, and that they currently employ a lot more people. And so the two fastest growing in terms of percentages are wind turbine service technicians and solar installers, like solar panel installers. And so that's like renewable energy. And those are also relatively small occupations currently. So they're having a huge growth, but you can see like the actual, numbers of people that are going to be more employed in those areas is relatively small. Whereas like nurse practitioners is a bigger career field, and so that's also going to grow fast, and that's going to mean that there's going to be a lot more need for nurse practitioners in the sense of, so the green bars are like projected changes in the thousands, and so for nurse practitioners, it's like 135,000 more nurse practitioners are going to be needed in 10 years than there are right now. Medical and health service managers is another one where there's like 160,000 more are going to be needed in 10 years, according to these projections. It is a similar theme where it's a lot of healthcare and then like kind of math and science and working with data. So like data scientists, information security analysts, computer and information research scientists, physical therapy assistants, operations research analysts. Now if we look at, these are the top 10 fastest declining occupations. Unfortunately, I don't have a nice figure for these, so you have to squint at the tables. But so these are the occupations that are expected to decline the fastest in the next 10 years. And hopefully you can read them. I mean, the main thing to focus on is like this column, which is the name of the occupation. And then this shows like the declining numbers in thousands. And then this is like the median wage, in case you're interested in that. But there is a theme here. So like the fastest declining occupation, so word processors and typists, roof bolters, in particular in mining, telephone operators, switchboard operators, data entry keyers. Most of these are things that they're declining because there's now technology that can do these jobs in terms of like basic data entry or word processing. Telephone operators, I mean, telemarketers was like, probably a lot of you get calls from automated telemarketers all the time. So these would be jobs that, not to saying that like there still is a need for people to work in these jobs, but it probably isn't like the most fruitful career path to pursue right now. And I think it highlights really the broad point of thinking about like, where's the workforce going? In what ways is this job going to be changed by technology in the future? And really, a lot of jobs are not necessarily going to go away because of technology, but they're going to change drastically. And so that's something to think about. And then last, this graph just shows that, this is from 2023. It shows the median usual weekly earnings and the unemployment rates stratified by people's education levels in the United States. So this is people 25 years and older all across the United States from the Bureau of Labor Statistics current population survey. So there's a very clear trend in that like at higher education levels, people tend to earn more and they are less likely to be unemployed. And so it does indicate that education still pays off in today's labor market. That doesn't mean that you should just kind of blindly pursue higher education, because it often does also cost money to pursue education. So thinking about it from that perspective is really important. But certainly our society still, our labor market values educational credentials. So I'll end with just a few take-home messages from today. First, for sort of the first part of the talk, hopefully I've convinced you that I think interest fit does matter, and it is useful to think about like what are you interested in, how does that connect to the interests of different jobs. But it may not be the most important thing. And also people, of course, differ in the extent to which they care about being interested in their job. And so I think it's totally okay if you don't end up loving what you do as Steve Jobs wants you to. Like, you can find ways to express your interests outside of work. That's okay. I would say, in general, job satisfaction often depends more on the people you work with and the organizational culture rather than like the actual job task that you're doing. So whether or not you feel like you're contributing meaningfully, like people notice when you do well, you're working in a place where you like the people you work with and people are positive, really makes all the difference, I think. As I showed at the very beginning, so the baby boomer generation across like the first 40 years of their working life held on average 12, like almost 13 jobs, and those numbers are increasing such that it would probably be about 15 or 20, I would guess, for like this current generation. So thinking about your career, not like, you're never stuck doing one particular thing. Your career really is a process. And I think often people do have bad work experiences. They end up with bad bosses. They might find themselves in a job that, they don't like for a number of reasons. And that is okay, at least for me. I think I've often learned more from work experiences that have been really bad than from the good ones. And so with this perspective that your career is a process, like it's okay if where you're at you don't love, but you'll learn more about yourself and what you do like, and hopefully apply that to wherever you end up next. And I think partly this is due to the sort of the way in which technology is changing work, and also relates to what I just said about people are going to change jobs a lot in their career. I think no matter what job or career field you end up in, really probably some of the most important skills are being adaptable, so being able to kind of roll with changes, and then also being able to market yourself. So that's in terms of like writing a good resume and cover letter, knowing how to talk about your skills and connect them to jobs. Because no matter what field you're going to end up in, that's going to make you more employable. And so especially that's where the Career Center at this campus, or there's lots of resources that are out there to help you in that regard, to use some of those resources. So that's all I have. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you all.
Let's just take a few minutes for questions. I'd like to ask everyone to just stay. We've got a few minutes left. So who wants to start us out?
Hi, Doc. You said the research with the 1 point something million took 10 years. Is this inclusive of COVID?
That's a great question. No, it was before COVID, those people's interests. So I think we looked at the labor market after COVID, and that hadn't changed drastically in terms of the overall findings, but it was people's interests, before COVID.
Hello, Kevin. You say really something really important about how the population is getting old and everything is getting automated. I want to know, because education doesn't mean social mobility. Having a PhD is great, but it's hard. Also, in the U.S., education is really expensive. So no, all of us is gonna get a PhD, of course, and that is the most growth area that you said, for those who has really good soft skills, in interpersonal communication, public speaking, but also you say it's really about personal branding, how we can present ourselves. For those who cannot get a PhD, what do you think is gonna be their works like?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there's several pieces to what you asked. And I do think, it's really important to re-emphasize this, that this doesn't mean that everyone should pursue these sorts of degrees. And also, obviously, if everyone did, there wouldn't be enough jobs for people to use their degrees. And so this is just showing the way it is now. I think there is a general trend in that, at higher education levels, you tend to be, less susceptible to economic changes, with COVID, for example, the people who are most likely to lose their jobs tended to be those that didn't have a college degree or below. But there's also, I guess, a simultaneous trend happening where increasingly companies are realizing, and maybe people are realizing that it's not like you said, also like education costs money and time, and so that's also time that you're not making money. So, there's a lot of jobs where you maybe don't necessarily need a bachelor's degree to do the work, but like it's just an automatic requirement of the job for whatever reason. And I think there is a growing trend of that companies not requiring that in order to broaden the people who, could work in the job. But I guess the caveat is like this is still the way things are, and like the term that is often used is like credentialism, where like our society is increasingly using credentials to hire people and determine like people's skills and knowledge, and that is basically making more and more people try to kind of climb up this ladder by getting credentials, which then makes it even more competitive if you don't have the credentials. And so I guess that's the background. And so the question is kind of like what to do about it. I think, I guess it depends on exactly like what sort of jobs you're interested in. But yeah, I think being able to market yourself, like being able to talk about your skills and having people to maybe practice with, or again, like using the career services that, your school provides is helpful. There's a lot of resources online as well. Also, like looking into specifically, like talking to people who are working in jobs that you're interested in, and what are their educational credentials, and talking to people in general about like their experiences finding work. You can find a lot of information online, but it might not always be like specific enough, or you don't get like the people's real experiences unless you go out and talk to people. So that's always like my go-to suggestion, is to really like, if you're interested in a job, you can read about it online, that's great, but try to find someone who's actually working in it, or not just one person, but 5 people, because people are obviously differ and have different perspectives, and ask them, like what, do they like their job? What do they have to do to get it? What's the current labor market like? So yeah.
I have teenagers, and they are unsure of what they want to do. So going and talking to people would be great, but they have no idea where to start. Do you have a suggestion online of some of these tests that you've done that are better than others? I know there's tons of them out there, but certain ones that I could maybe have them test or check into?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess I had a slide at the very beginning that showed like the ONET interest profiler, which is, there's a website called careeronestop.com that it's just career one stop. That's like 3 words, all no spaces next to each other, and they host like the interest inventory, and then they also have like a skills and knowledge test and a values test. It's all on one website, and then it's connected to like information about the occupations as well, in a kind of user-friendly interface. So you can also just Google like ONET interest profiler, and it'll take you to a different version of that same test. I'm always like suspicious. There's a lot of companies who also offer these sorts of tests, and some of them I've discovered are literally just, because this is like a public domain thing. I've actually worked on this a little bit, and so ONET wants to sort of give it away, but then there are companies who just charge people to like use it in their own interface, and so it's not always better to pay more for those sorts of services. But I think that, if you go to careeronestop.com, like you can take the interest inventory, they can take the skills and knowledge, and they can take values, and then together that should, if you see occupations that are popping up repeatedly or a couple times, those could be things to explore. I think the broader advice too, like when I was, really trying to figure out what I want to do, I was so afraid of like making a choice and being stuck, and so I just didn't do anything for as long as I could until I was finally forced to find a job. And I learned, like, I think like it doesn't really matter. Like in some ways, like you don't really know that much about yourself until you actually try different things. And so just finding anything that seems appealing, roughly, can be helpful as a start, and you kind of learn about yourself more along the way.
I was just wondering if the prediction for the AI for the 47%, have they done a new prediction for that?
That's a great question. They've done many new predictions, I'll say, and there's like a lot of companies have coming out with their own predictions. And I think, especially with like the generative AI, so like ChatGPT, like that was one thing that also like it's changed what occupations are going to be most affected. And like as you know, if you've used ChatGPT or like the image generating software, like it can. At the time that 2013 projections came out, like they thought that like kind of the creative skills, like art and creative expression, were like the most human-like, and that AI would not be able to do that. Whereas it turns out that like actually that AI can write relatively well and create art in ways that were sort of unexpected. So that's just to say that again, like no one really knows exactly how technology is going to develop, but there's lots of new projections, yes, and I think if you Google it, you'll find probably like 10. I've done some research also where we kind of like try to look at comparisons across them in terms of like is there a consensus in terms of which occupations are going to be more or less exposed, and I would say the overall answer is like not super consensus. So there's sometimes I agree, sometimes I don't. Like, I mean, I do think like, yeah, telemarketing, for example, would be one where, not that a lot of people want to be telemarketers, but it would be something that is going to increasingly phase out. But even like 10 years ago, people were saying that there's going to be no semi-truck drivers in 10 years because, technology is going to be able to, we're going to have self-driving cars, and that has not played out either. So the good news is, well, in like psychology, like in terms of social work and counseling, like there's also an increasing number of companies that are trying to develop like chat bots that can do some of that work. And I think that there is real value, or there could be real value in that. But there's still going to always be a need for social workers and counselors to actually talk to people. So I know I'm kind of not answering your question, but the answer is there's a lot of different ideas out there, and I think there are some overall trends, but like again, like no one knows exactly for sure what's going to happen.
Hi. So for oh my God. Okay, never mind. For like programs in like 7th grade going to like high school, like kind of like job seeking programs or like or career days, how effective are those like for students to be able to find an interest that they have, or like for a future career in a sense?
Yeah, that's another great question. I think they're very effective. I mean, I don't know of any research exactly that has tested it. I have 2 younger sisters who are both teachers, and one of them kind of was like at her previous school, she organized that, and she basically like she was the one organizing it, there would be nothing like that. And I know one year they brought in like a physical therapist to talk to the students, and then after that physical therapist left, like half of the class wanted to be a physical therapist all of a sudden. So I think like partly when we looked at that study and looked at how there are a lot of discrepancies between young people's aspirations and the number of jobs that are actually available, it really is like the jobs that you can't aspire to something or be interested in something that you don't know exists. And so I think that's super important, and that, there's not enough, in my opinion, like resources being devoted to career development at a young age, and really the focus doesn't need to be on like, tracking people into like, you're set on this career when you're in 7th grade, but just really broadening people's, understanding of what is out there and what do jobs actually look like out, so that they don't, rely on what's on TV. So anyway, thanks for these great questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hoff. Thank you.